minutes or 15 minutes or 10 minutes. Depends on how much money gets put up on the pulpit here in the next few minutes here. And anyway, it's always a blessing to be here. Good to see some faces who've been backslidden for the last few months, like Daniel Munoz and other people who just haven't been around lately. And just kidding, Daniel's one of our Bible college young men, and he slipped out because he heard I was preaching and wanted to come hear me. And not really. He had no idea. Okay. And just don't leave, Daniel. That would look really bad. And take your Bible, turn to the book of Acts. Book of Acts and chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. I think this morning will keep your attention. And I've been praying the whole last week that it would be a blessing and that it would help you. Acts chapter 27 and verse number 41. Verse number 41. We're going to enter into a story here, and we're going to read these verses and show you what happened, and then we're going to go back and show you what led up to this. Let's all stand together here, and either out of respect for the Word of God or just to stretch your legs. If you can't stand, then by all means stay seated. Not a problem at all. And some of you just sat back down, right? And anyway, there's a wonderful story here in the Bible. Acts chapter 27 and verse number 41. Let's start at verse number 40. We'll read verse number 40 and 41 together. And I'll read, you follow along. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast, and remained unmovable. But the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards, and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. There had been a huge storm going on named Euroclydon. That's how I've always said it. Then I heard a preacher say it a different way. I thought, oh man, I've been wrong all my life. And but a huge storm in the Mediterranean Sea, and the ship, several weeks of just horrible storms, waves, wind. They had gotten to the point where they had thrown everything out of the ship, even the tackling that helped them hoist the sails and lower the sails on this merchant ship here. And they'd thrown all the cargo overboard. They'd thrown everything out, and they had no hope left. And eventually, they crashed. That's the story, and that's where we come into it. Father, thank you for all you've done for us. I thank you for your word. Thank you we have a book that we can trust completely, that we can look into to see your will, to see your mind, to see your desires, to see what you want, and that we can honor you with those, with the information and the knowledge that we glean from it, that we could honor you with our choices and our decisions in life. I pray help us as we look at the life of Paul here this morning, that it'd be a blessing to us, that it'd help be an encouragement, and that we'd gain something from your word that would help us this week as we go through our life. In your name I pray. Amen. You may be seated. This is a story that everybody looks at, I think, if you read about it, and you think, oh, wow, that's an amazing story. But none of you want to be there. That's for sure. And we're going to go through here a little bit. We're going to go back all the way to the early on in Paul's life, and we're not going to turn there because it'll take quite a bit of time. Many of you know the story, but in the book of Acts, chapter 7, the apostle, or Stephen is stoned. And Stephen, one of the first deacons, we call them, one of the men here filled with the Holy Spirit and serving God and going out and preaching the gospel, who was taking charge over some of the responsibilities in the church of making sure people got enough the food that they were supposed to get. He was out preaching, and he made some people mad, and the religious crowd hated him, and he got taken out, and he got stoned to death. I mean, literally, if enough people didn't like you, and they didn't like what you said, they had the right to take you outside of town, pick up rocks, and throw them at you till you were dead. They had to have a good reason, obviously, and or else they'd get in trouble. And so that's a different story. But we come down to it at the end, the last chapter, in the last verse in the chapter, it says, and they cast their coats down at a young man's feet whose name was Paul. And Paul was consenting unto his death, and Saul, and that introduces Saul. Now, Saul was a Pharisee. He had been raised all his life as a very religious, very sincerely religious young person. He had sat at the feet of Gamaliel, I think that's how you say his name, and he had been taught ever since he was a young man. He grew up in the city of Tarsus, which is on the northeast shore of the Mediterranean Sea, close to Syria, and he'd been growing up there in that town there, not to be confused with Tarshish, which was where Jonah was fleeing to over by Spain, and I got those mixed up, and I had to correct my thinking there. And but Saul grew up there on the coast of the Mediterranean, probably as a boy sailing in boats out on the Mediterranean Sea, probably fishing. We don't know, but what any boy in a coastal town would do. And one day he got into this teaching and this training, a desire to serve God, a desire to be a devout Jew, a very sincere man. I really believe he did. And he became a religious zealot, and nobody was going to hurt his church or his beliefs or his God. And this led all the way up to the time of the founding of the New Testament church in the book of Acts, where the Apostle Paul was consenting to Stephen's death because Stephen was of that religious crowd that was trying to destroy what he had always believed in and destroy what he knew was right. And then the Apostle Paul went on through, and he became this guy hunting people down. He was hunting down Christians. He was literally taking soldiers, getting letters signed by the authorities, and he was going to where there are pockets of Christians who were followers of Christ, and he was getting them arrested and thrown in jail, hoping that they would be executed for their blasphemy. And we can criticize the Apostle Paul all we want, but I really truly believe he was doing this out of a love and a zeal for God and for his belief and his faith there, even though he was wrong. You know the story. Eventually, he was on his way to Damascus, and he had a train of soldiers with him and some other people with him. He was going to find some Christians and arrest them, and all of a sudden, a bright light shone, knocked him off the animal he was riding on, and Jesus spoke to him and said, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" And he said, "Lord, who art thou?" And he said, "It is Jesus of Nazareth. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." I think God had been working on Saul's heart. And he that day, he became a believer. He did. He became a Christian right then. There was no problem with his beliefs. It was just he's believing in it, and all of a sudden he realized, oh, Jesus really is the Messiah. I'm so sorry. And you can imagine the guilt following along with him the rest of his life through all that. And but at that point in time, a major change took place in the life of Paul, and he became one of the world's greatest missionaries, greatest Christians as life progressed for him. He ended up in Antioch. He ended up in Jerusalem. He ended up back in Syria, in Antioch there. Him and Barnabas became the first missionaries sent out by the local church. And the Apostle Paul was a fiery debater. And he was smart. And he could take what people believed that he knew, and he could use it to show them the scriptures and show them the word of God and convince people and show them why Jesus was the Messiah. And him and Barnabas started churches all across modern-day Turkey and over into the Eastern European countries there, all the way over into Macedonia, almost all the way down into Italy, and but definitely down into Greece. And they started churches all over there, and they came back to Syria, to their home church in Antioch, and they shared the good news, how not just the Jews, but the Gentiles are getting saved. And there's doctrinal issues. Now, bear with me. If this is all new to you, just bear with it. Understand, Paul was a great man, right? Great man. Great things in life. That's the point of this right now. And he gets back to Antioch, and he becomes, they're so excited. The church there in Antioch is so excited about that God's winning the Gentiles and God's winning the Jews, and there's all these different churches being started, and these churches are multiplying. Not the churches growing bigger, the churches are multiplying. Like there's one church, and now there's 5 churches, now there's 10 churches in these towns, and they're studying the scriptures and studying the word of God, and they're growing in Christ, and they're believers. And then him and Barnabas decide to go back and let's revisit all these churches, and they go back, and eventually there's an argument between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark, and beware of anybody named John Mark. No, just kidding, John Mark, okay. One of our where's oh, there he is, yeah. He's a good kid, though. Don't worry about him. And anyway, argument, Paul and Barnabas split ways. These good men, they got an argument and they split up over an argument, over some kid, it's just, but anyway, it happens. Good people get in arguments, and that happens sometimes. Anyway, the Apostle Paul went up north. We never really hear about Barnabas again. Apostle Paul went up north through all the churches and took Timothy with him and Titus and some other people with him and revisited them and did more work and encouraging and saw problems and helped the churches with problems. And he came back home, and then there's another missionary journey. Anyway, He finally gets back after these missionary journeys and doing all this great work, great ministry, bombastic ministry, people getting saved, people trusting Christ, churches growing, all this stuff. And he comes back to Antioch, and he tells people what he wants to do, and he wants to go back to Jerusalem. He says, I'm an old man. I don't have many years left, but I have a heart for my people, a burden for my people. There's even a prophet named Agabus who came up and says he took Paul's girdle, his belt off, and wrapped it around his hands and said, the owner of this girdle is going to be bound in Jerusalem. And anyway, very dramatic people. And and Paul's like, I know that's a pretty good chance I'll be arrested, but I want to go back. And I've heard people criticize Paul. And we're going to start there at that decision. Paul made a decision to go back to Jerusalem because he wanted the Jewish people to be saved. He didn't want them lost in their religion. He wanted them to know about the Messiah, know that Jesus was the Messiah. And he had this really strong burden. It was such a strong burden, he said that I would rather be cursed and have my people be saved. Most people take that to mean he would willingly offer to go to hell if his people could trust Christ. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what he meant or not, but he had a huge burden for the Jewish people, and we're going to pick it up right there. Chapter 23. Chapter 23. We're not going to read anything here, but if you want to write down where this is, that way you can go through these passages, because we're going to look through chapter 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28. So unless you want to spend this morning reading all those, and if you have a pen, just write it down. In chapter 23, the Apostle Paul makes the decision to come back to Jerusalem. He runs into, you know what, turn over there. This would be a good kickoff here. Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. And if this is going to be a lot for you, we won't do it here, and just sit and listen, and you'll get it here. And actually verse 22, the Apostle Paul here has got it, if I'm in the right place here. Yeah, Acts chapter 22. And Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21 and verse 21. He comes down to the church at Jerusalem, shares the good news of all that God has done. The church is so excited. But there's some people who have an issue with Paul. There's been some rumors getting back that the Apostle Paul has been teaching people to not keep the law, to not follow the law of God. And that's a problem in the Jewish religious culture that is in Jerusalem. And so they told Paul, look, you got to get rid of these qualms and these doubts that people have about you. So why don't you do this? And so in verse number 21, it says, and they are informed of thee, these people, they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. Take them and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. And so they're telling Paul, look, Paul, there's a lot of people criticizing you. They're not going to accept you. There's going to be problems. We got to get rid of those doubts here. So why don't you go with these 4 other men, take this vow, shave your head. Now, you know what you look like when you shave your head, right? Your head has not seen the sun for a long time, and so it's a lot lighter than the rest of your skin. And anyway, so the Apostle Paul goes in with these guys, and he's in the temple with this vow, and just because he wants people to know that he believes the law, and he wouldn't have done this had these people not advised it. And so he goes in, and here's where the problems begin. So I'm going to talk you through these problems here that he had going. And once again, I have these all written down in my notes. We don't have time to turn to all of them. But these Jewish people hear that Paul is in the temple, and they start spreading rumors. Paul brought a Greek into the temple, and that is against the law. You cannot do that. And so they get a group together. They go into the temple. They drag Paul out, and they have a court hearing that is just crazy. There's no order to it. The Apostle Paul's about to get torn in pieces, and the centurion that's there, the guy in charge of keeping order, he sees it happening. He gets his soldiers. He runs down, and he rescues Paul from that group only to just arrest him. He's like, why are you causing trouble? Arrest him. Put the cuffs on him. So first of all, we have Paul being falsely accused. And then we have Paul arrested by this centurion. And then Paul gets up and he says, hey, can I speak a word to them? and he stands on the stairs of the castle and preaches the gospel to these people, and they're in a frenzy. They hate Paul so much they're not going to listen to anything that he says. And then he gets locked up. Centurion locks him up in the jail cell, and he says, hey, we got to figure this out, and there's a trial, and it's not going to work, and finds out that there's these assassins waiting for Paul, and they're going to kill him. In fact, they vow a vow not to eat until they kill Paul. Well, that's a dangerous vow. Like, come on, guys. If you're going to vow a vow, don't vow a vow not to eat until something. What if it never happens? Just think about it, all right? These people are not too bright, okay? And anyway, Paul's nephew hears the planning going on, and Paul's nephew comes in, and Paul says, Paul, you won't believe this. This is what's going to happen. And anyway, he gets back to the centurion. Centurion writes a letter, and he sends Paul off with several hundred soldiers to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea is on the coast. That's the political getaway town, and that's where the political people are. And Festus is there at the time. And Felix is there at the time. Felix, I don't know. I wrote it down. Who was there at the time? And Festus is there. And or Felix is there. I'm sorry. It is Felix. Felix is there in Caesarea, and Paul gets there, and he gets put under house arrest. Now, can you imagine this? All the great ministry Paul had, all the liberty, all the traveling, all the good things, all the souls saved, all the great ministry he had, now because he decided to go back to Jerusalem. This is probably not a wrong decision, but our choices have consequences. He almost gets torn apart by these Jewish people. He gets arrested with no reason for being arrested by these government people, and he gets a military escort to another town where he gets put under house arrest, and the Jewish people come and they have a trial there in front of Felix. Now, Felix is standing there. There is a trial here, and there's nothing but lies spread about him. Absolute lies. None of them stick. All of them are refuted. There is no reason to keep Paul locked up, but Felix decides to keep him locked up just to please the Jews, and he's hoping that Paul will give him some money to bribe him to let him go. So now Paul is locked up for 2 years. Not in a jail cell. He's got like a little house, but he's got a soldier guard there, and he can kind of go, and people can come in and see him, but he has no liberty. The Apostle Paul, this guy who'd done so much, been so blessed in his ministry, no liberty now. He is locked up and left there for 2 years. After 2 years, Felix gets replaced by Festus. Festus comes in. The Jews back at Jerusalem, they didn't get anywhere with Felix. Like, hey, new guy's in town. Let's go attack Paul again. And so they come, and Paul has to stand at another trial. Another trial. It's a mock trial. It's all made up stuff. None of the stuff they're saying is true about him. They hate Paul so much they're willing to lie about him to get him condemned to death. Festus is there, and Festus lets Paul speak. And Paul once again just gives the gospel. Tells his testimony, tells what is happening, tells what God did for him, and tell him that I have done nothing that they have said, nothing blasphemous. They can't present any evidence for me, against me. And so Paul's standing there defending himself very successfully. And at the end, after clearing his name of everything, Festus says, well, yeah, but you know what? You really should go back to Jerusalem and stand trial with this religious crowd. Paul says, no. I'm a Roman citizen. That's not my courthouse. My courthouse is here, or before Caesar. And if you won't hear me here and give me justice here, I appeal to Caesar. So now Paul has to appeal to Caesar in Rome. Festus says, you sure? He's like, yes. If I go back there, they're going to kill me. I got more work to do in my ministry here. Ministry of being under house arrest. So he appeals to Caesar. Chapter 26. Chapter 26. You don't have to turn there, but if you want to write it down or you want to find it, King Agrippa shows up on the scene. King Agrippa comes in to visit his friend Festus. And anyway, Festus tells Agrippa, hey, I got this guy I don't know what to do with. It's this religious zealot. And he's in his friends, all those other religious zealots, they're after him to try and kill him, but he's done nothing that's worthy of death. And anyway, do you want to hear him? And Agrippa's like, yeah, I'll hear him. And Paul gets up and stands before Agrippa. And what does he do? He gives him the gospel. He just gives him the gospel. He tells him what happened to him. He tells him about the day when he's on his road to Damascus. He tells his whole story, what happened, and there's no reason I should be in these bonds. And Agrippa and Festus get off in their corner talking together, and Agrippa's like, this guy's done nothing wrong. Let him go. And Festus is like, I can't. He appealed to Caesar. Once you appeal to Caesar, you can't break your appointment. Unless you die. I mean, if you die, obviously, no choice in the matter. But he said you can't break that appointment. So now, because Paul appealed to Caesar, once again, another choice he made. He appealed to Caesar, a choice in life. Now he's stuck. Agrippa would have let him go. would have let him go completely. Now he's stuck because of another choice that was made in life. No, we're just showing you a pattern of things that happen in life, all right? And he's appealed to Caesar. King Agrippa wants to let him go. Festus says he can't because he appealed to Caesar. And so eventually, just a little while later, he gets on a ship headed to Rome. And on this ship headed to Rome, there's Paul, there's the centurion that is guarding him and the other prisoners that are on the ship. There's the captain of the ship, and they dock at one of the islands. But, it's not a great island. It doesn't have all the conveniences that the ship captain and the crew would like. And because winter's coming, the storm season is coming, and they don't want to be stuck at an island that's inconvenient. And so they're about to set sail. And the Apostle Paul, who knows the Mediterranean Sea very well, he goes up to the centurion and says, hey, look, I know I'm not the captain, but there's going to be some bad storms coming, and we are not going to make it before the stormy season comes. The centurion says, oh, really? That quick? Okay, thanks for telling me. He goes, talks to the captain. Captain's like, no, we'll be fine. Right? Look, I sail these waters. I'm the captain. It's my ship. Hey, we'll be okay. So the centurion takes the captain's word over Paul's. We'd probably do the same thing. And they set sail, and all of a sudden the storm hits. The storm just pummels them. It pummels them, and it beats them, and it wrecks them. They loose from Crete. Euroclydon comes, and now chapter 27, verse 17. Chapter 27, verse 17. We're going to come and start reading here. 27, verse 17. It says, when they were taken up, when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and so were driven. And being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lighted the ship. This is verse 19 now. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. Verse 20. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. Now, can you imagine Paul here? He's been falsely accused. He's been arrested. He made a decision to appeal to Caesar that kept him from being released. He's now on a prisoner ship headed to Rome after having all sorts of lies told about him, after having his liberty taken away from him. He finally gets on a ship, and the guy doesn't listen to you, and you were right, but now everybody's going to die because this guy didn't listen to your good advice. And the ship's captain, who is just concerned about the convenience of life, is the one that risked everybody for his own comfort and his own convenience to find a better place to winter in. And now you're sitting there, and you've had a storm that's been blowing for days and days. The sun had not been shining, and the stars had not shone in many days, and there's no small tempest. You're having to throw stuff out of the ship. No hope left in the ship. How are you feeling as Paul? This is not a good situation to be in. Verse number 21. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. Now look at verse 27. But when the 14th night was come, 2 weeks this has been going on, in the middle of a storm. Now bear with me. Everything will wrap up at the end. We're just giving you the story here. 2 weeks of being driven up and down in the sea, in the storm. About midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near some country. Now, you don't want to get close to shore in a storm. Because if you get close to shore in a storm, your ship's going to wreck. And you don't want to be in a shipwreck. I mean, people die in shipwrecks. People drown in shipwrecks. So go down to verse number 31. Verse 30, I'm sorry. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. Now these sailors, they're like, hey, we're getting out of here. Come on, don't tell anybody. Let's lower the ship down. Let this boat down. Let's get to shore. Because those small boats, they go all the way to shore. And anyway, Paul saw what was going on. Verse 31. Paul said to the centurion, that's the same guy he advised about the storm, remember that? And to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. Centurion's like, well, I didn't listen to the first time. I'm going to listen to him now. And so, verse 32, then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. Their lifeboat's gone now. All right, 33. And when the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. These guys haven't eaten for 14 days. Can you imagine the attitude on that ship? 14 days not eating on the ship. Wherefore I pray you take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And they were all of good cheer. Doesn't food do that for you? Makes you happy? Yeah. Comfort food? Yeah. Some of you like that? Some of you aren't. Some of you, food has no attraction to you at all. You just eat to survive. And I cannot relate to you, okay? I love food. And when we had eaten enough, in verse 38, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore into which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. So it all comes down to how can we get the ship to the shore and us to shore safely. They've already gotten rid of the cargo. They've gotten rid of the tackling. They've gotten rid of everything that could be gotten rid of to make the ship ride as high as possible so they get as close to land as possible. They barely in the dark dim of that daylight that can't quite get through the clouds see a creek there, kind of a river flowing through, and think, well, that's going to be deeper there. Maybe we could let the wind blow us right into that creek. And so they just do it. They let the main sail up, and they let the wind just drive them, and the ship is just flying there, and it hits the bottom. And they're flying so fast in that ship that the front of the ship gets stuck. And verse 41 says, and falling into a place where two seas met, they ran that ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable. Now, when the front of the ship is stuck and the waves are beating on the back of the ship, guess what happened to the back of the ship? It is wrecked. It says, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. Now, this is not a good situation. This is where our text verse was. They say, hey, everybody can swim, jump out, swim to shore. If you can't swim, you better find something to float with because you're going to shore or you're drowning. And they let everybody jump off and go to shore. In the verse chapter 28, this is our final chapter here. It says, and when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. Now, they're shipwrecked. They're on shore. At least the people there weren't cannibals. I mean, they're built a fire for them, not to cook them, but for them to warm themselves up. And now, what would you do if you were Paul? You're cuddling around that fire. You're getting close to that fire as possible. You're cold. You're wet. You're tired. Paul's pretty old, not an elderly man, but he's not a young man in this story here. And so what does Paul do? He goes out to help gather firewood. And look at these little things about these great people you can learn. He isn't there worried about himself getting warm. He's over there worried about what can I do to help. He's a servant here. This is a great thing here. And and verse 3, and when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. So in that bundle of sticks that he scooped up, must have been a poisonous snake in there that kind of got pinched between all the wood. And when he dropped it on the fire, that snake got released, came out and latched right onto his hand. If bad could get any worse, this is where it gets worse. Because you have a little hope. Man, you escaped the ship. You're on shore. You got a fire. Hey, we're going to make it. Oh, I guess not. And they all knew it was a poisonous snake. And so he just took it, and he's like, just shook it off. Almost like, oh, come on, can't believe this. Just shook it off in the fire. And all the barbarous people, the natives of the island, they stepped back. He's going to die. How long is he going to last? I don't know. They might be placing bets on him. I don't know. And he never dies. He doesn't die. God delivers him through this. Now, all through this story here, I was thinking about people that I know and people in this room and people that I've heard of. And I'm thinking about how difficult life can get. And thinking about how Paul's life turned from great, exciting to falsely accused, imprisoned, falsely accused again, having to go through all the difficulties surrounding the government and legal stuff, and starting to think about all the things that have to do with friends forsaking him, people thinking badly of him, starting to think about all the things that happen as a prisoner. You're put on a ship, probably locked up on the ship, and you're sailing away. Life has definitely took a turn for the worst, a downhill turn for Paul. People don't listen to him. He's in a storm. They finally get to shore, and he's got this venomous snake on his hand. And we could go to, if you want to go later, 2 Corinthians chapter 13 gives a long list of all the things that happened to Paul, all the difficulties that he faced, all the problems that he faced. You think, what's the point? Why go on? My ministry's over. I'm a prisoner. I'm off to Rome to stand before Caesar. I probably won't survive. In the meantime, I probably won't even survive this storm. I've had difficulty after difficulty and after difficulty, and I've been trying to do my best. I've still, when I've been able to, tried to give the gospel, tried to do my part, tried to do my duty, trying to tell people about you and what you've done for me, and now I'm finally escaped on this island. You gave me hope, saying that nobody would die, and now I've got this venomous snake on my hands. Man, all of it led up to this one point here. And I could see Paul thinking back. If I would have taken the advice of Agabus with my stupid girdle around his hands, and if I would have listened to all the other godly people that were there saying, don't go to Jerusalem, none of this would have happened. I would probably still be there. I'd probably still be starting churches. I'd probably still be making a difference in my life. And now I'm stuck here. I'm cold. I'm wet. I got this poisonous snake hanging from my hand. What's the point? Now look at verse number 7 of chapter 28. In the same quarters, or the same island, the same area, were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, others also, which had diseases in the island, came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors, and when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. Now, I'm not sure exactly everything that went on the island, but the Apostle Paul had a trend in his life. He had a goal in his life. His goal was to start churches. It was to get the gospel out. It was to get people growing in the Lord. It was his commission. It was his passion. It was his ministry. And all the way from the time he was knocked off his animal and blinded on the road to Damascus, all the way up until this point, he had kept consistently faithful to this goal. He had been just trying to do his best to serve God. And then when this downhill turn took place, and he got arrested, and he got falsely accused, and his own religious crowd that he'd once been part of was trying to kill him, and they were trying to throw him up before the government, and the government didn't know what to do with him. And then he had a corrupt politician wanting money for his release, so he kept him locked up. And then he had all this other stuff happen. Now he's going through a storm. Now he's going through all these difficulties and these trials. He has to throw himself from the water and swim to shore. He's trying to even be a help then as a servant, and trying to tell people to be of good cheer, and trying to encourage other people in the Word of God and in the ministry, and show them that the God that he serves stood by him that night and told them nobody would be lost. I guarantee you that Publius heard the gospel on that island. And I can guarantee you that Publius' father, who was sick, who got healed, heard the gospel on that island. And I can guarantee you that all those others which had diseases on the island and came and were healed, that they heard the gospel on that island. I can guarantee you that there were so many people on the island of Melita that did not know the gospel. They'd never heard the gospel. They'd never heard of anybody named Jesus. They'd never heard of anybody who offered salvation. They'd never heard of any God that loved them, that never would have heard about how God loved them had Paul not ended up shipwrecked on the island of Melita. Now, let me tell you something. In life, when life gets you down and you start getting a downhill course in life, and there are decisions you made that might have caused you to go down, there are decisions others might have made that put a downhill slope in your life. There are decisions or life circumstances that just happen that start to get you discouraged. Let me tell you something. One day down the road, there's an island of Melita, and there's a Publius, and there's a people that never would have heard what Apostle Paul had to tell them had Paul not way back here with Agabus decided to go to Jerusalem. Be really careful when you start thinking, oh, I wish I would have never done that back there. If I just would have made a different decision back there, life would be different now. Instead of looking back with regret, saying, I wish I never would have listened, I wish I never would have made the decision back there, how about where we're at right now? We look forward and say, all right, who is God put in my path today that I can make a difference to today? The Apostle Paul was way back here, and over again, either he made a choice or other people made choices that kept him down, that kept him from going, that kept him from being what he was supposed to be, that kept him from going to the churches and ministering to the pastors and ministering to the churches, and he did what he could. There's other decisions that came up that kind of put him down there and locked him up and spent more time in prison. And most of your Old Testament books that he wrote were written from a jail cell. And one day, when all life seemed down and all life seemed horrible and all life seemed unbearable, instead of sitting down by the fire and quitting on what he knew he was supposed to do, he shook the serpent off and went on and said, God has put these people in front of me, and he's got a plan, and he's got a will, and he's got a purpose in my life. And even though I may not be traveling around church to church as one of the greatest evangelists the world has ever seen, I can take this small little village here, and I can do what good I can here, and I can give them the gospel, and I can tell them about Jesus, and I can serve, and I can pick up firewood, and I can do the things that God has put in my life for me to do. There's so many people, I believe, that they get discouraged. We all get discouraged. Things happen in our life. And as we're going along life, a wrench is thrown in the gears. We're tripped up by something. A marriage is lost. A child is making horrible decisions and choices. We have hurt in our family. We have hurt at our job. We have hurt at our work. Our busy schedule is made even more busy. We're not able to do the things that we're allowed to do. Our health takes a turn for the worse. We're no longer able to teach our class. We're no longer able to be out where we wanted to be and where we once were. And we start getting discouraged, and we start figuring out that God must be done using me. God must not have anything else for me to do. Well, I've got news for you, because it doesn't matter what life situation you're in this morning. It doesn't matter what hurt you've had. It doesn't matter what difficulties have been caused. It doesn't matter what warnings you have not heeded or that you have heeded. It doesn't matter what mistakes you've made in the past. Where you are today is exactly where Paul was, and our focus is not back at the decisions that we have made in the circumstances that have happened. Our focus is on what is in front of us and what God has for us to do today. A lot of times our discouragement comes because we are focused on our mistakes of the past instead of looking at the opportunities that God has placed in us in the future. You've heard it jokingly many times. Pastors say, if I ever get arrested for preaching the gospel, I'm going to start a prison ministry. That's exactly what this is talking about. Where God ends up with you, where you end up with God, what we need to make sure we do is make sure we stay there with God. Too many children of God, difficulties happen and we turn away. We quit. We sit down. We decide we're just going to stay by the fire and we're going to nurse our wounds and we're going to be there. Some of you today, you may be by the fire right now. You may be nursing your wounds. You may be trying to figure out what to do next. Well, let me encourage you. Get up away from the fire and go find some firewood. Start there. Just go off and say, hey, let me see what I can do. Let me see what God will allow me to do in my life. Let me see what I can do to serve. Let me see what I can do at the position I'm in. Is this the ideal situation? No, I'm dripping wet. I'm cold. I'm discouraged. I haven't had much food for 14 days. I just had my last meal last night, and now I've got this poisonous viper on my hand. I shook it off. I'm probably going to die soon, but let me see what I can do for God and for the people around me. Some of you today, you may be on the ship and the storm is blowing. You may not know what to do. Your life may just be a turmoil right now. It's just confusing. It's a wreck. You see all these possibilities of the horrible things that could happen. You don't see any hope. And like on the ship here, when there was no more hope, when all hope was lost, maybe you can be the one because you stayed close to God and you stayed close to Him and you stayed in His Word and you stayed close to Him. You can be the one to stand up, and those around you going through the same storm, you can say, hey, I think, God said everything's going to be okay. And we may get in a wreck, and we may get shipwrecked, and we may end up having to swim to shore with all the waves beating us into the sand. And we may come crawling out of the waves with our ears full of sand, and our eyes full of sand, and our nose full of sand, and our belly button full of sand. And all of you that spend time at the beach, you know what I'm talking about, where you get tumbled in the waves, and you get there, and we may end up there, but guess what? Even though we're sandy and tired and wet and weary, we're going to be okay. And you can be the one to encourage those around you. You see, the Apostle Paul should have never been on that ship in the first place. The Apostle Paul should never have been locked up in prison. The Apostle Paul should have never been under house arrest for 2 years. The Apostle Paul should have been released after that first trial when he was proven to be innocent, but because a corrupt politician now said, I want some money for his release, it may not even be a decision you made. It might be something that the government does. Like, oh, God, I can't believe you let this happen in my life, and I'm so discouraged. I'm so hurt. And we kind of blame God for what goes on, when guess what? Apostle Paul, greatest missionary the world has ever seen, had it all happen to him. Now, I don't know about you, but I know in my life I face discouragement all the time. I face difficulties all the time. But failure doesn't come because of difficulties. Failure doesn't come because of hardship. Failure doesn't come because of bad decisions. Failure comes when we stop. You guys that are athletes and played on sports teams, failure doesn't come because you get a rolled ankle or you get a hurt muscle or you get a hurt knee or you get a hurt shoulder or you get a broken collarbone. Failure comes when you decide to quit and not play anymore. As a Christian, failure comes when we decide to stop doing what God has provided us to do today. Look, every man in here, every lady in here, every boy and girl in here, every teenager in here, God has something for you to do today. He's got a purpose. It doesn't matter where you come from. Doesn't matter what your background is. Doesn't matter what mistakes you made in the past. Doesn't matter what difficulties have happened in the past. Doesn't matter who your mom and dad is. Doesn't matter who your kids are, what your kids have done. Doesn't matter what your spouse has done. Doesn't matter if you split up, if you lost a marriage or have a new marriage. Doesn't matter if you're on your 10th marriage. Doesn't matter one bit to God. God says, look, as long as you are willing to look forward and say, God, what do you have for me to do? He says, I can use you. Now, as people of God, the choice is up to us. Because I'm sure there's somebody in here who's right at the brink, sitting down by the fire and giving up. But there's a Publius out there. It might be a grandchild who needs you. It might be a son or daughter that needs you. It might be a neighbor that needs you. And if you stop today, the whole island of Melita may never know about the gospel. Some of you may have been stopped for a while, and that's okay. But maybe it's time to get back up and get going again. Because we have a God, in Romans 8:28, says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. As long as we keep God first and say, okay, God, I've made a lot of mistakes, but what can I do today? What can I do tomorrow? What opportunities do you have for me to do? If we keep our eyes forward, God always has something for us to do. Look, some of you, it might be you bake cookies for me. No, just kidding. You might go to a junior church teacher and say, hey, is there something I could do for the kids in junior church? It might be something you could do for a bus route. Say, hey, could you use treats on the bus? I could bring treats for the bus. You know what a blessing? Hey, bus captains, how about this? Plug for you. What if somebody in here adopted a bus route and just decided, I'm going to take that bus route and I'm going to make sure they have treats every single week to give to the kids? Man, that's a great idea. What a great ministry. You could be the baking ministry right there. And I put John 3:16 on every cookie, all right? And you could do something like that. It's something. It's looking forward. What can I do? What can I do for God? What opportunities does he have for me to do? And every time Paul had an issue come up, he tried to get the gospel out. But then when he was tired and wet and cold, he just looked to see how he could help people with the firewood. There's something we can do. There's something we're able to do in life, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from. Now it's just opening our eyes and praying and saying, God, would you show me what you have for me to do? Father, thank you for all you've done. Thank you for your word. Thank you for these stories here and for us to be able to use other people's difficulties to help us. And these are great illustrations to realize in our hearts that as much difficulty as we've had, others have suffered as well. And they've shown us how to persevere. They've shown us how to keep going. They've shown us how to be blessed. So God, I pray you take your word and use it as an example. Now, with our heads bowed and our eyes closed, we're going to have an invitation in just a second. But if you say, Brother Josh, I